Donald Trump's calling our Somali neighbors garbage and the state of Minnesota a hellhole is I'm assuming is unfair.
What if someone enforces Sharia law? There's a lot of talk of that.
Enough is enough. Enough is enough.
There's a lot of talk about people in Minnesota are terrified that someone's going to enforce Sharia law in a lot of these Somali Muslim areas where giant Muslim populations are.
We are doctors, we are teachers, entrepreneurs, we are elected representatives of our...
Tim Walz's legacy survived elections, but it didn't survive a Joe Rogan conversation. One podcast, Zero Mercy, and suddenly people were asking questions no one planned for. What flipped the switch? Why did it unravel so fast? And how did a casual chat turn into a full-blown legacy audit? Stick around, because this clip is awkward, funny, and a reminder that a microphone can be far more dangerous than any debate stage.
Video of Tim Walz doing the exact same thing.
Right.
Exact same thing. And
Yes.
he said, of course, it's a Nazi salute. He said that.
Right.
We spent 3 days debating, having them trying to debate that President Musk gave a Nazi salute. Of course he did. But that is a distraction.
This is how crazy things have gotten. Like,
It's coordinated.
you haven't seen that? No. The video of him taking down the Minnesota flag.
The moment Joe Rogan began circling Tim Walz's legacy, something quietly perfect happened. No shouting. No fireworks. Just that slow, creeping realization of, oh, we're actually doing this. It's the kind of moment where a politician's mental filing system starts glitching because the conversation isn't following the usual script.
He's out there talking again.
You say you could fight any Trump supporter?
Yeah.
I think I could kick most of their ass. I do think that if they want to do it. I know I can outrun them, but I don't know if we're going to fall into that place where we want to.
He says he kicked their ass, and they're scared of him because he could fix a truck. Like they're threatened by his masculinity. I know how to fix a truck. So he said, like, do you?
I think I scare them a little bit why they spend so much time on it. But no, I'm serious because I can fix a truck. They know I'm not bullshitting on this.
Yeah.
I'm not putting this in people's grill.
I bet you don't.
The lady doth protest too
I bet
much.
you.
This wasn't a shouting match or a viral ambush stitched together in an editing room. It was worse. It was curiosity with endurance. Joe Rogan didn't accuse, he wandered. And as he did, Tim Walz's carefully polished legacy began to feel less like a monument and more like an IKEA bookshelf assembled at 2 a.m. technically standing, but one wrong move away from collapse.
Governor Tim Walz, who was running for vice president.
I'd never seen this before. People driving by my house and using the R word in front of people. This is shameful.
They just passed something in Minnesota where illegal immigrants are allowed to have driver's licenses and vote, which is kind of crazy.
And I have yet to see an elected official, a Republican elected official, say, you're right, that's shameful.
A lot of the reason for wanting an open border is congressional seats.
So look, I'm worried. We know how these things go. They start with taunts, they turn to violence.
Because one of the things about when you do a census, it doesn't.
At first, everything sounded fine, almost respectful. Tim Walz's record floated in the air like a resume at a networking event. Accomplishments earned polite nods. Decisions stood neatly in place. But Joe Rogan has a way of quietly unsettling the room. He asks the question no headline ever does. Okay, but what happened next?
They're lost. I mean, they're also lost in that they can't control the narrative anymore. I think when they had control of Twitter and they had control of essentially all of social media and pre-Trump, they had the reins like firmly held. They were in control of the public narrative. If you strayed from that, you will be kicked off social media. You'll be banned from YouTube. And for things that were factually correct. Like the lab leak theory is now finally being.
That's when the temperature in the room changed. Joe Rogan didn't frame Tim Walz as a hero or a villain. He treated him like a human with a long career and a stack of convenient summaries attached. And nothing makes a legacy sweat faster than being treated like open source material. Suddenly, Walz's past wasn't being celebrated, it was being examined. Not aggressively. Casually. Like someone turning a product box over to read the fine print. You could almost feel the moment Tim realized this conversation wasn't about praise, it was about patterns. Legacies thrive on distance. They survive on time, speeches, and selective memory. Joe Rogan collapses that distance. He pulls the past into the present and makes it answer for itself. No teleprompter required. The energy slowly shifted from confidence to calculation. Not denial, but navigation. Words became careful. Certainty turned flexible. The The kind of verbal gymnastics that only appear when someone realizes their Wikipedia summary doesn't cover the follow-up questions.
Tim Walz is your VP? Weird. You don't think that guy's weird?
Elon's on that stage, jumping around, skipping like a dip. You know it.
He's weird in every way. Yeah. The way he walks, the way he waves his hands.
He reminds me of the clown emoji.
This has only renewed the call for Governor Tim Walz to resign.
He's a bizarre guy.
He's a strange dude.
He is currently running for a third term as governor, but this has really ramped up under his watch as all of this fraud exploding onto the national scene. I think it's 5 or 6 federal investigations that have now been announced in Minnesota.
Joe Rogan stayed calm, and that's the part that really unsettled people. No dramatic pauses. No raised voice. Just steady curiosity and a refusal to skip the uncomfortable parts. Like someone lightly tapping glass to see where it flexes. And flexing doesn't mean collapse, it means inspection. Tim Walz's legacy didn't fall apart. It wobbled. And wobbling is far more interesting, because wobbling invites questions. Why were certain choices celebrated while others quietly slipped into the context folder? That's where the internet leaned in. Not because Tim said something outrageous, but because he didn't. Every answer was doing 3 jobs at once: explaining the past, protecting the present, and safeguarding the future. Rogan kept pulling threads, never tearing fabric, just tugging enough to see what moved. Tim responded like someone realizing the conversation had shifted from ceremonial to real. That's when the legacy started sounding tired, not defeated, just worn from carrying the same story uphill for years. Then the real question surfaced: was the hill ever necessary? Rogan didn't challenge intentions. He questioned outcomes. And outcomes are the one thing a legacy can't argue with emotionally.
Something right when the Fox News crowd is all bitching at me like crazy. Like, I'm loving it.
That guy was almost the vice president of the United States.
Elon Musk was crying last week. Tim is being mean to me, you know, like, yeah.
I'm sure you've seen that thing where it shows Obama saying, I need a vice president that's dumber than me.
He may or may not have cognitive decline problems at his age, but at her age, she's just dumb.
Yeah, Biden and Biden I was saying that I need a vice president dumber than me.
Great. Kamala Harris may be the dumbest person ever.
Because intentions are feelings, outcomes are receipts. Tim Walz leaned into nuance, usually a safe place to land. But nuance under a microscope starts to look like fog. Joe Rogan didn't dismiss it. He asked how it actually played out in the real world. That's when explanations began multiplying. One answer required a clarification, which needed historical context, which led to bigger forces, which ended with, well, it's complicated. Complicated is honest, but it's also contagious. Once it enters the conversation, certainty quietly exits. The audience noticed. Comments filled with variations of, I didn't know that, and why isn't anyone talking about this? Not outrage, just curiosity. And that pause matters. It forces reflection. It forces someone like Tim Walz to confront the gap between how the story feels internally and how it's experienced publicly. When those two don't align, things get awkward. Not scandal-level awkward, human awkward. The kind where you realize your greatest hits album skipped a few tracks people remember all too well.
Walz, if that guy got into power.
And for one thing, don't ever shy away from our progressive values. One person's socialism is another person's neighborliness.
Like if Kamala died and Tim Walz, Tampon Tim, was our president.
I used to think the Democrats were crazy for saying that men have periods, but then I met Tim Walz.
You know how crazy this country would be?
These guys come up with the weirdest damn ideas that you will ever imagine. You know it's true.
That weirdo who puts tampons in the boys' room. What about?
Meanwhile, Joe Rogan never positioned himself as the authority, and that's the trick. He stayed the curious listener, which meant Tim Walz had to do the explaining. Explaining your own legacy in real time is like narrating a movie while it's still playing. You're never quite sure which scene the audience is focused on. As the conversation unfolded, Tim's tone shifted from declarative to reflective. Less this is what happened, and more this is how it looked at the time. Fair enough. But fairness doesn't erase questions, it generates more of them. Rogan didn't pile on. He let silence do the work. And silence is loud when expectations are high. By the end, nothing was resolved. No winner. No viral knockout. Just a legacy rotated slightly, revealing angles people hadn't considered. Tim Walz wasn't exposed, he was contextualized. And context is dangerous, because it strips away simplicity. Somewhere out there, another microphone is warming up. And that's the clever part of what Joe Rogan did to Tim Walz's legacy. He didn't kick the door down. He opened a window.
When they decided that J.D. Vance was weird. Yeah. Remember that one?
He calls me weird, but then he lies about how his kids were conceived. Who does that? That's just the weirdest thing I've ever seen.
And then they just weirds everywhere.
Weird. Oh, you don't want a weird guy. Meanwhile, you have fucking Tim Walz. Is your VP? Weird. You don't think that guy's weird?
Super weird.
Because Minnesota, I mean, they picked this guy. He is weird. Right? I'm not weird. He's weird.
He's weird in every way.
Yeah.
The way.
And once fresh air gets in, people start noticing how stuffy the room really was. Legacies are climate-controlled environments curated, maintained, and carefully dusted by people who know exactly which angles photograph best. Joe Rogan doesn't care about the lighting. He flips the switch and lets the shadows fall where they may. Suddenly, Tim Walz found himself in that uncomfortable space where past decisions stop being bullet points and start becoming conversations. Not debates, real conversations. The kind that don't end when the clock runs out or the applause cue hits. The kind that linger. Rogan didn't ask Tim to defend every choice. He asked him to sit with them. And once you notice that shift, it's impossible to unsee. Tim wasn't flustered in any dramatic way, no meltdown, no visible panic. It was subtler than that. The calm that comes from realizing you're no longer steering the narrative. You're sharing the wheel. And Joe Rogan is famously allergic to backseat driving.
That the First Amendment doesn't apply to misinformation or hate speech. Okay, well, it certainly does.
I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
Sometimes people say things wrong, and the goal of the First Amendment is you say something wrong, and then this guy who's an expert says the right thing.
I've stopped all government censorship and brought back free speech in America. It's back.
Well, so much of it turns out to be true. How about masks don't work? You would get screamed at for...
Every time Tim Walz tried to frame his legacy in broad terms, Joe Rogan gently pulled it back to specifics. Not as accusations, but as anchors. Anchors that keep stories from floating too far above reality. That's when the audience really leaned in. People are tired of weightless narratives. They want gravity. They want to see how decisions ripple outward, not just upward. Rogan understands this instinctively. Tim Walz understands it academically. And those are very different things. As the conversation unfolded, Tim's legacy began to sound less like a finished chapter and more like an ongoing footnote. Not rewritten, re-examined. And re-examination always feels personal, even when it isn't. Rogan never painted Tim as uniquely flawed. But Tim still found himself explaining not just what he did, but why people might feel differently about it now. That's dangerous territory for any legacy, because time is undefeated. What once sounded decisive can start sounding evasive.
Tried to claim that his wife got pregnant through in vitro fertilization, and she said that's not true. So he lied about that.
Some of you might have heard this. This is very personal for my wife and I. When Gwen and I decided to have children, we went through years of fertility treatments. And I remember each night praying that the call was going to come and it was going to be good news. The phone would ring, tenseness in my stomach, and then the agony when you heard the treatments hadn't worked.
The First Lady of Minnesota, Gwen Walz, revealed that she underwent a different fertility treatment, not IVF, called intrauterine.
What felt pragmatic then can feel cold now. Joe Rogan let that contrast breathe. He didn't rush to judgment. He gave Tim Walz enough space for the tension to form on its own. And that tension didn't come from hostility, it came from honesty colliding with expectation. At a certain point, the conversation stopped being only about Tim Walz and started becoming about the system that rewards simplicity and punishes reflection. Rogan never said that outright. He didn't need to. The implication just sat there heavy and unmistakable. To Tim's credit, he didn't retreat into slogans. He leaned into explanation. But explanations have limits, especially when people are already questioning the frame. That's when the focus shifted again from what Tim intended to how it was received. Rogan thrives in that quiet. He doesn't fill it with conclusions. He fills it with space. And space is where people draw their own lines. That's the real threat to any legacy, not criticism, but autonomy.
Complete pathological liar.
Let's be honest. There are outsiders coming into communities, stealing and moving jobs away, and making life harder for people living there. And they have names: Donald Trump and J.D. Vance.
Complete liar. Lied about being in Tiananmen Square. Lied about being a head coach of a football team.
Because this started, and I love this story, as a young prosecutor. Kamala Harris talked about going in that courtroom for the first time.
Pathological liars. People that are habitual liars. They just lie all the time about everything. Yeah. Oh, you didn't deploy for war. You didn't.
By this point, Tim Walz's legacy wasn't being judged, it was being handled. Passed from listener to listener, each adding their own interpretation. Joe Rogan acted less like an interrogator and more like a courier, delivering questions and letting people decide what to do with them. And the internet did what it always does when ambiguity appears. It overanalyzed everything. Short clips became long threads. Long threads turned into amateur think pieces. Tim Walz's name started showing up next to words like reevaluation and reconsideration. Not condemnation, reconsideration. The most unsettling word in politics. Rogan never crowned himself the arbiter of Tim's legacy. He positioned himself as a mirror. And mirrors don't attack, they reflect. Sometimes from uncomfortable angles. He didn't rescue Tim from the awkwardness. He let it exist, giving the moment credibility. There's a strange honesty that surfaces when someone realizes they're being listened to, not judged. Tim seemed to reach that moment mid-conversation. Defensiveness softened. Language slowed. The legacy stopped performing and started reflecting. That reflection didn't offer clean conclusions, it offered complexity. And complexity is kryptonite for viral narratives, which somehow made the whole thing even more compelling. Instead of a takeaway, people were left with a question.